It's a great pleasure to be here tonight with Reza Aslan. Many of you I know have read his book already. It's a phenomenal piece of scholarship and writing. His credentials range from Harvard Divinity School to the University of Iowa, University of California. I had a list of his degrees, I ran out of paper. But the thing that struck me in reading both this book and your earlier book is this is an author, this is a scholar with a tremendous amount of curiosity. And it comes through in the book, and I think it's one of the things that makes it such a joy to read. So Reza, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone church, this amazing bookstore. I just have to admit one thing. I sort of felt like John and I were getting married as we walked down. So I feel very close to you right now. We'll see how it goes.
Yes, well, without further ado, I thought, we would start at the beginning. Let's start with the title. It's a word that in modern parlance has some pejorative kinds of connotations, but historically and in context, it's a much different word and a much richer word.
Yeah, that's right. That's a very good point. I mean, yeah, in the modern language, zealot has negative connotations, as you say, but it didn't in Jesus' time. On the contrary, most Jews in Jesus' time would have proudly referred to themselves as zealous for the Lord. In fact, all the great biblical heroes, prophets, kings in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament as it's sometimes called, were known for their zealotry. You see, zeal is an actual biblical doctrine. It's a biblical principle in the Hebrew Bible. It's not just a word. It meant something very specific. It meant that you were a Jew who had an uncompromising devotion to the Torah, the law of Moses. That you were a Jew who refused to serve any human master. The only master that you would accept is the master of the universe. And most importantly, it meant that you were a Jew that was dedicated to the sole sovereignty of God. That God was your only king. And again, this is the foundation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's how the entire land of Israel was conquered from the Canaanites through this power of zeal. In Jesus' time, zealotry was not just a widespread phenomenon, but it was experienced in many different ways. There were bands of zealots who experienced that conception of the sole sovereignty of God by completely divorcing themselves from society. They would go off and live almost in what a kind of a quasi-monastic environment. Some zealots would take up arms against the Roman occupation. After all, if you believe in the sole sovereignty of God, then that means that you cannot abide by the occupation of the Holy Land by a pagan, heathen empire. And throughout the first century, actually, bands of zealots would rise up in rebellion against Rome and be crushed. Rise up and be crushed. Rise up and be crushed. This happened over and over again throughout the first century until the year 66 AD, 30 years after Jesus died, when it worked. When a group of zealots roused the Jews to revolt against Rome, and they managed to kick the Jews out of the Holy Land, keep them at bay for 3 or 4 years until the Romans returned and killed everybody, which is what they do. But all of this is to say that calling Jesus zealot is a way to emphasize that these principles, this devotion to the Torah, a refusal to submit to earthly authority, and a dedication to the establishment of the sovereignty of God, what Jesus referred to as the kingdom of God, are all deeply a part of who he was and what he was trying to do.
Well, it raises a second question that focuses on Jesus as a man, a historical character, which we know very little about, and yet skipping ahead 300 and some years from his time, the Council of Nicaea the basic article of faith for Christians is the Nicene Creed, which says explicitly, he was made man.
Fully God, fully man. Yeah.
How were you able to parse together a portrait like this? It must have been like shooting a camera in the dark with just blurry outlines, and yet what emerges is a very real and vibrant person.
There is no question that this is an exceedingly difficult enterprise. It's one that scholars have been doing for about 200 years, the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. It goes back about 2 centuries. And so there have been many, many scholars who have laid the groundwork and the methodology for trying to, as much as possible, dig through the layers of doctrine and interpretation that have arisen around Jesus, and to get as far as we can to the core of the person himself. But you're right, the problem with that is that outside of the New Testament, there's almost no trace of this man who would so indelibly alter the course of human history. And so what we have to rely upon instead is what we can tease about him from the world in which he lived. This is one of the wonderful things about first century Palestine. While we know very little about the historical Jesus, we know almost everything about the world in which he lived, thanks in large part to the Romans, who, if anything else, were pretty good at documentation. They were good at a lot of things, killing people, but documentation was another strength of theirs. And so what I try to do is take what little we can be fairly confident about in Jesus. That he was a Jew, which seems obvious, but it's a good idea to remind ourselves of that every once in a while. That he started a Jewish movement sometime in the first third of the first century, the purpose of which, as I said before, was to establish the kingdom of God. And that as a result of that movement, he was crucified by Rome as a state criminal. You take those 3 things, you put it in this world in which he lived, and a biography starts to arise. And then you can go to the Gospels to sort of fill in the holes, if you will. You take the claims of the Gospels, you analyze them according to what we know about the history of the time, to try to figure out how much historical weight you can put on these claims. But even when that is said and done, you still have an incomplete image. There's still a lot of holes in that image of Jesus that is constructed. And at that point, that's where one of 2 things comes. A person of faith would say that's where faith comes in. And you fill in the holes with faith. A scholar would say that's where educated guessing comes in. And you fill in the holes with the best, most knowledgeable guess that you can find. But in many ways, those 2 things aren't necessarily in conflict with each other. It goes back to the beginning of your question. This fundamental paradox at the heart of Christianity, that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. This, as you know, I used to be a Christian for many years. And this was always the doctrine that was so difficult for me to wrap my mind around. And by the way, it's supposed to be. I mean, that's the mystery of faith, right? But I think the problem is that it's almost impossible to not have the fully man part of that dual identity be utterly subsumed by the fully God part. No matter how hard you try to think about Jesus the man, and the trials and tribulations that he faced, the struggles that he must have faced, the fear that must have been involved in his actions, the threats that he confronted, there is always this safety net, if you will, that is his divine nature. It's always, this must have been terrible, but then again, he was God. I describe it, and I don't mean to be flip here, but I describe it almost like seeing a tightrope walker with a net underneath him. You just don't care that much. Take away the net, and all of a sudden, you're deeply invested. And I guess the reason that the overwhelming response of Christians to this book has been positive. In fact, I get dozens of emails a week from Christians telling me that while they obviously believe that this person that I'm describing is God, the book actually empowered their faith because it takes away that safety net. And it says the consequences of the belief that he was whatever else he was, that he was a man, means that he lived in a specific time, in a specific place, that he confronted specific powers, that his teachings were in reaction to specific social ills, and that this world shaped who he was and how he thought. And that's something that I think many Christians don't often get a window into.
I think that the other piece of this, and you allude to it, is that as he becomes the Christ, and the teaching is that he has a great deal of understanding of human nature, of human fears, of human passion, that is reinforced by the fact that he has had all of those emotions, feelings, experiences as well, and provides an empathy, for lack of a better word,
yes,
that connects us to the divine.
I was having a conversation with a pastor friend of mine, and I mentioned what I just said, that I always had a hard time with the concept of the incarnation because of the safety net. I always felt as though I couldn't fully understand Jesus as a man because he had the safety net of God there. And he said, that's funny, because I've always thought about it in the opposite way, that the incarnation is God without a safety net.
Interesting.
Which is an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah. When you delve into this, and as you do in your book, what also emerges are a tremendous number of contradictions in the man himself and what we have been taught. Those don't seem, from the book at least, don't seem necessarily in conflict. They seem to round out the man. What got you interested in those conflicts that were then easier to let them go?
It's a very, very astute point, John. I mean, there are a great deal of contradictions about this man, not just between the different Gospels, which seem to paint quite different portraits of him, but even within Gospels themselves. Partly this has to do with the fact that Jesus himself was a man of contradictions. I mean, one day promoting peace, one day talking about war, one day promoting a sense of ethno-nationalism, one day promoting a sense of universalism. So part of that, the multiple images that arise of Jesus in the Gospels, has to do with him himself. He seemed to have been a very complex man with many contradictions. But part of it also has to do with the fact that what we have of Jesus is not exactly eyewitness testimony of his words and actions. What we have of Jesus is testimonies of faith written by communities of faith many, many years after the events that are being described. The Gospels are not historical documents, they are theological arguments. In other words, the Gospel writers already had an opinion about who Jesus was, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God, that he was in fact God incarnate. And then they wrote the Gospels to prove that belief. And I think that provides a window into how we should read these Gospels. That these stories and the facts within them are secondary at best to the truths that are being revealed about Jesus. And when we think about the Gospels in that way, then some of these contradictions and conflicts start to make sense, because they are less about the things that Jesus himself said or did than about what the people who wrote about him thought. And one thing that every scholar of early Christianity knows, I mean, it's a unanimous notion about this movement, is that with the death of Jesus, this movement fractured into dozens of different versions and ideas. Everyone had their own conception of who Jesus was and what he meant. Some people thought that he was just a man, a Jewish teacher. Some people thought that he was purely divine, that he had no human capacity at all. As a matter of fact, they believed that what you saw when you saw Jesus was an illusion of his human body. Until the Council of Nicaea took care of all of that and created one version of Christianity and everybody else became heretics. But until then, there were multiple views of this, and one can very easily understand how you can get 20 different interpretations from these four Gospels.
I think and you alluded to this again in the book, you begin to see this movement, the earliest, one of the earliest in the epistles themselves, and you actually can see some of the process that you're talking about.
Very much so, yeah. And I mean, that's so the first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was written by the estimation of most scholars not long after 70 AD, so just after the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe 71, 72 or so. The last Gospel of John was written anywhere between 100 and about 120 AD. But the epistles of Paul, the first epistle was written sometime between 48 and 50. So, that's 20 years after Jesus' death. So already what we're starting to see is the formation of theology. But what is fascinating about Paul, a man who, by the way, never met Jesus, never knew Jesus, never walked with him or talked with him or ate with him or prayed with him, but instead had this ecstatic experience of him long after his death. What's amazing about Paul, what's interesting about Paul's letters, is that he seems to have no interest whatsoever in the historical Jesus. Absolutely, almost no event from Jesus' life is ever mentioned by Paul, except for the Last Supper, which is not mentioned as a historical event, but as a ritual formula that he's repeating, and of course the crucifixion and the resurrection, which are central to Paul. But nothing Jesus ever said is quoted by Paul. Nothing Jesus ever did is mentioned by Paul. So Paul, although he wrote so much earlier than the Gospels, doesn't become a very good source for the historical Jesus because he says nothing about that person.
The world that Jesus inhabited and the early Christians was filled with gods and goddesses. They were thousands of them. How does this small sect manage to move its way through and ultimately come to primacy? How in your view did that work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. How did a movement, a Jewish movement, started by a poor, pious, very likely illiterate, uneducated, marginal Jew from the backwoods of Galilee, what nowadays we refer to as a country bumpkin, for the liberation of the Jews from Roman rule, become the largest religion in the world. I mean, that's a brain teaser. Partly, obviously it had a lot to do with Jesus' message himself. It's a remarkable, extraordinary message of social justice, of the reversal of the social order. But the truth is that message very quickly becomes diminished as this movement, after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, becomes focused almost single-mindedly on no longer converting Jews, but instead converting Romans, which was a pretty good idea on the part of the early church, by the way. And when that happens, Christianity begins to become syncretized with this, as you say, this plethora of Roman religiosity. It becomes malleable. It absorbs itself into Roman and Greek worldviews and religions. It doesn't create new holidays, it just takes over the holidays that were already there. the principles that it espouses, the most important of which is the notion that Jesus was God, which is anathema to everything Judaism has ever said, thought, or believed about the nature of God and man, but which for the Romans was second nature. A God-man? I mean, Caesar's a God-man. That makes perfect sense to Rome. It's that adoption by not just Romans, but the Roman elite, and the malleability of this religion, the way that it can evolve and become whatever you want it to be, that suddenly turns this tiny little sect of Judaism into the largest religion in the world.
Well, and it offered more, I think, in terms of more of an interaction than some of the classical gods, for example, and more of an onus of responsibility, which seemed to appeal to people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And there was something, I think, very appealing about Christianity, particularly in those first couple of hundred years after the death of Jesus and after the destruction of Jerusalem, that appealed especially to an elite Roman audience. And I think it had to do precisely with what you're talking about, the sort of conception of an absolute morality, this idea borrowed in many ways from the Roman mystery religions and mystery cults of a communion, an organization of individuals coming together to form a single body. All of those things were very, very appealing to Roman audiences.
This issue of basic principles seems to be one that carries through from your earlier book on Islam, No God But God. What started you on that? It would have been a much easier thing to let that go, but trying to backtrack into the essence of these things seems to be a challenge for most people.
Yeah, I did not grow up with a lot of religious instruction or spiritual edification at all. I came from a fairly secular household. We were culturally Muslim, but not in any serious way. I don't ever remember going to a mosque. I don't ever remember reading the Quran. I knew nothing about the Prophet Muhammad until I was 25 years old. But I've always been deeply, deeply interested in religion. I think partly it has to do with my family fleeing revolutionary Iran and witnessing for myself, even as a child, the power that religion has to transform a society for good and for bad. And I think that, in a sense, that fed my imagination in a way. I mean, reading scriptures, regardless of what the scripture is, reading scriptures and trying to understand not just the message being conveyed, but the historical and the literary and the cultural context of the scriptures, trying to break it down to its elements, its basics, as you say, has always excited me. This is something that, even when I was a kid, my parents couldn't understand it, why I was interested in this stuff, but I'd always been interested in it. And so when I entered college, I knew it's what I wanted to study, and it's never ceased to fascinate me, and I love talking about it. That's the other thing too. I love talking about it. If you haven't noticed, I love it.
Well, there does seem to be a universality that comes through, at least in your two books, that the differences are not as great as sometimes they're portrayed when you get to the basic essences.
When you study the world's religions, the very first thing that you discover is that every religion, and no matter how separated they are by time and distance, is saying the exact same thing, using the exact same myths, sometimes telling the exact same stories, but using a different set of symbols and metaphors to do so. And that's all that religion is. Religion is nothing more than a language to describe what is essentially inexpressible, undescribable. and that is faith. It's just the symbols and the metaphors that help us to express that feeling of transcendence to ourselves and to each other. It's a language like, and I mean that quite literally, I don't mean that in a figurative sense. I mean, it is a language of symbols, the way that English or Japanese or French is a language of symbols. And just in the same way that if I were speaking French to a French audience, they would understand me, but a German audience wouldn't understand me. It's the same thing about religion. If I said to the people in this room that I have been washed by the blood of the Lamb, raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Raise your hand if you don't. See? That's just a language. The people who know what I'm talking about know deeply what I mean by that statement, how profound and emotional that metaphor, which is all that it is. In the same way that if I'm speaking English and you happen to understand English, you understand what I'm saying. The people who don't understand the metaphor, it sounds nuts, doesn't it? I mean, I might as well be speaking Chinese. And that's exactly what I'm trying to say. That if you don't understand English, you don't understand what I'm saying. That's all religion is. And for me, the same way that I am adept at multiple languages, I'm equally adept at multiple religions. But I think in English. And in the same way, I express my spirituality through Islam. But I can communicate, in other languages.
Well, this is, as you all know, a tour de force, and I think it's also a very courageous book to try and write. I think we're going to open it up for questions at this point. So if you'll raise your hands, Sarah has the mic, and we can entertain some Q's and A's or something like that.
This is kind of odd, but I'm just going to throw this at you, okay? But you have to talk into this little thing.
Well, I had a couple questions that really the one I'm curious about is, did Jesus consider himself, in your opinion, as a zealot, given his references to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and so forth? So he obviously had a connection with society and didn't isolate himself from that.
Yeah. Did he consider himself a zealot? Is that what you mean? Well, I think most definitely he did, and the best proof of it is the verse that you just mentioned. This actually is the sort of founding argument for this book, this dramatic scene in which Jesus enters Jerusalem proclaiming himself as king, and then takes part in this violent action in the temple, where he cleanses the temple, breaks open the cages of the money, breaks open the cages of the beasts waiting to be bought for sacrifice, turns over the tables of the money changers, etc., etc. And then, as we are told in the Gospels, the Jewish authorities recognizing his zealotry. In fact, this wonderful moment in the Gospel of John where the disciples watch this event take place, and then John says, and they remembered what the Psalm said, "Zeal for your house consumes me." So even the disciples understand the zealotry of this action. But the authorities, the Jewish authorities, understand it best. And so they decide that they're going to trap him. The Gospels actually say that they devise this trap. And the trap is precisely what you're saying. They walk up to him, they hand him a denarius coin, which is the coin used by the Jews to pay the tribute to Rome. And they say, "Tell us, Rabbi, is it lawful to pay the tribute to Caesar or not?" Again, this is not a question, it's a trick. And the problem is that we're not told in the Gospels why it's a trick. We're just told it's a trick. But if you know about the history of Jesus' world, you understand where the trap comes from. You see, ever since about 4 BC or so, around the time actually of Jesus' birth, so for most of Jesus' life, the quintessential test of zealotry was whether you paid the tribute to Rome or not. The tribute was seen as proof of the Jews' subservience to Rome. Remember, the tribute was not a tax. Everybody paid their taxes. But on top of the taxes, every male subject had to pay an extra denarius coin that was given not to the empire, but to Caesar. And it was given to Caesar as an admission that you belonged to Caesar, that the land belonged to Caesar. And so the Zealots refused to pay the tribute. They would go to their deaths refusing to pay the tribute because they refused to say that the land belonged to Caesar. So, when the authorities asked Jesus, should we pay the tribute or not? They're asking him an altogether different question. What they're asking is, are you a zealot? And Jesus' answer, which has been rendered ever since the King James Bible, into what you just said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God, is in reality the clearest signal of his zealot tendencies, his zealot sentiments, because what he says in that moment is not render unto. That is not what the Greek word apodidomi actually means. The word apodidomi is a very sort of specific term. It means give back. And the way that it's used is to describe something that you are giving back to someone that owns it. In other words, if I, came to your house and borrowed your rake, when I came to return it, that's apodidomi. I am giving you back what belongs to you. So what does Jesus say? Whose face is on this coin? He asks. And the authorities say it's Caesar's face. And he says, and whose name is it on this coin? And the authorities say, it's Caesar's name. And then he says, so then, give back to Caesar what is his coin. It's his coin. His name and face are on it. And give back to God what is his. Every single human being who heard those words knew exactly what Jesus meant by give back to God what is his. Because what is God's is this land, and it has been taken by Rome. So give it back. In fact, not only is that the most overt sign of Jesus' zealotry, it's enough to have him arrested almost on the spot. Almost immediately after that scene, he and his disciples go to hide out in the Garden of Gethsemane, which I always have to remind people is not a garden. I mean, there's not a bunch of fountains and birds in this. It's not a place with picnic tables that you hang out in. The Garden of Gethsemane is a forest. It's where you go to hide out from authorities when they are coming after you. And that's exactly what he does after that sentence. It's the last thing that he says in Jerusalem before they go to hide out.
In one of the Gospels, it says, well, I think in all of the Gospels, the titulus about Jesus on the cross was King of the Jews. And then in 3 days, this person on the cross is dead. And they take him down. But then they put him in a tomb. Now, I was familiar that one of the reasons for crucifixion was not so much the killing of the person, it was making evidence that you shouldn't do this again, because they keep him or her on the cross. And I think in that same way, and maybe in your book, there were 2,000 that were killed, Jews who were killed.
Thousands.
Yes, thousands and thousands. They stayed on the cross where the birds and the dogs and so forth. But this one person was taken around, down, and put in a tomb, and nobody said anything about it. how did that happen that he got this benefit where others did not?
Yes, very good question. You're right about crucifixion. This is actually a really important point that you bring up. We think of crucifixion as Rome's version of capital punishment, but it wasn't. It was actually often the case that Rome would kill you first, then crucify you. The purpose of crucifixion was to act as a deterrent, not as a capital punishment. As a matter of fact, the only crimes for which you could be crucified under Roman law were crimes against the state, crimes like sedition or treason or rebellion or insurrection. That's it. People always say, well, what about the thieves that were crucified alongside Jesus? Well, they weren't actually thieves. The Greek word that the gospel uses is lestai, and lestai doesn't mean thieves, it means bandits. And bandit was the most common term in Jesus' time for an insurrectionist, for a rebel. It was just sort of the catch-all term for a troublemaker, for someone who was seditious. And you're right. As a deterrent, the purpose of crucifixion was to remind every subject person what happens when you defy the will of Rome. That's why crucifixions were always done in public, in marketplaces, in open lands. The place of Jesus' crucifixion, Golgotha, was literally at the entrance to one of the main gates in Jerusalem. So as you walked into Jerusalem, the first thing you saw was a hill full of thousands of dead and dying people who refused to obey the will of Rome, as a little reminder to you of what happens. And you're also right that under Roman practice, you were not removed from that cross until nothing was left of you but bones. Again, the purpose was to humiliate you and to act as a deterrent, to frighten the rest of the subjects. Burial was not in the cards for someone who was crucified. And the Gospels, I think, recognize this. What they say is that a particularly wealthy Pharisee who in some versions of the Gospels was a follower of Jesus and others was sympathetic to Jesus, paid to have Jesus' body removed from the cross and put into a rock-cut tomb, which I need to explain to you, is the equivalent, I guess the monetary equivalent of, the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, the idea of being buried in a rock-cut tomb. You have to be the richest man in Jerusalem to be buried in a rock-cut tomb in the first century. The story is suspect, historically speaking. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. However, the job of the historian is not to say what's possible. The job of the historian is to say what's likely. And in this case, that story is not very likely. But again, from the position of faith, it's absolutely possible that that happened.
Any other questions?
One of the many things that I enjoyed while reading your book was the candor at the very beginning and throughout about the possibilities that you're talking about, the probabilities that you're talking about, and admitting fully that there can be other interpretations wildly different from yours that may have just about as much justification. And I was reminded of another book that I read recently that I'm sure you're familiar with, that collection of essays by Robert Price, The Christ Myth and Its Problems, I think is the title. In any event, I think your books are quite different. Yours is systematically arranged, his is kind of scattergun approach. But he also admitted that his denial of the historical existence of Jesus is an interpretation, but indeed he admitted that there can be an equally good argument to be made for the
Yes.
And I'm wondering since you take the position that Jesus indeed probably did historically exist, given that both of you are approaching this with remarkable candor, what would a conversation between you and Robert Price be?
Very good. Yes, I believe what I say in the book is something to the effect of, for every eminent and well-researched position about Jesus, there is an equally eminent and equally well-researched position refuting it. And what I try to do in the notes section of the book, at the back of the book, I always try to hide my research as much as possible so that the book is actually enjoyable to read, is provide the people who disagree with almost every point that I make and why I disagree with them. This is how this Jesus study works. I mean, 2 centuries of arguing about this stuff. With regard to the issue of him existing or not, however, I'm very, very firm on my belief on this. I'm willing to be swayed on most of my interpretations. I mean, I think you have to be a good scholar if you can't say that, then you're not a very good scholar. Except for that one. And the argument relies on what I had said earlier. Take away the New Testament, there's almost no trace of this man at all. Except for this one meaningless throwaway clause in the historian Josephus, writing around 94 CE, 94 AD. So 60 years after Jesus, but nevertheless. And Josephus is writing about important people, people who actually matter when it comes to history. The governor of Jerusalem, the high priest, significant people as far as he's concerned. And he's telling this story about an event that takes place in the year 66 or so, in which this governor, we know him by the name of Festus, all of a sudden dies. And a vacuum of power forms as the Jews are waiting for the next governor, Albinus, to arrive from Alexandria. And at this time, there's this very young, fiendish high priest by the name of Ananus, part of this wealthy, very corrupt family of high priests. A real thief and a swindler, this guy is, according to all the chronicles that we have about him. He decides he's going to take advantage of this sudden vacuum of power in Jerusalem and start putting to death some of his enemies. And in the midst of this story, Josephus mentions one of these people that he puts to death, this man by the name of James. And then this is how he describes James. James, the brother of Jesus, the one they call Messiah. And then he moves on. And he continues talking about, again, people who matter as far as Josephus is concerned. Insignificant as this little throwaway clause may be, and make no mistake, the one they call Messiah is meant to be derisive. It's like, the one they call Messiah. That's what he's saying. As insignificant as it sounds, it's enormously significant for historians, because it's the first and earliest proof that we have that not only did this person probably exist, but by 94, he was so well known as the founder of a movement that Josephus assumes that you'll know which James he's talking about if he mentions James's brother. That's enormously significant, I think. And I think it really puts the burden of proof upon those who, like Richard, who believe that Jesus did not exist. To the larger question, however, let me just say very, very quickly, I think the true dividing line when it comes to examining Jesus is not whether you think he existed or not. And I don't think it's whether you think he's God or not, or whether he's Messiah or not, or the Son of God or not. I don't think that that's what the dividing line is. I think the true dividing line when it comes to understanding Jesus, regardless of who you are or where you're from or what you believe, is whether you think that he was utterly unique or not. What I mean to say is this: either you believe that Jesus was unlike every other Jew of his time, that his perception of God was different from the perception that every other Jew in the first century had, that his experience of the Hebrew Scriptures was completely unique and totally unprecedented, that his definition of the Messiah was wholly and utterly new, or you think that he was remarkable, extraordinary, charismatic, certainly worth knowing, even worth following, but not unique. That his view of God was more or less what everybody else in his situation, in his time and place thought. That his definition of the Messiah was more or less what everybody else's definition of the Messiah was. That his perception of creation and creator, of the Scripture and the role of humanity and the forward progress of Jewish history was more or less aligned with what everybody else thought. That's what I believe. Which is why I think that the key to understanding who the historical Jesus was to put him firmly in his time and place and view him according to what others like him thought. But I accept absolutely the premise that he could have been utterly unique, that his views could have been wholly innovative, unlike anyone else that had ever come before him. That's possible. But again, I have to come back to this one thing. The job of the historian is not to say what's possible. The job of the historian is to say what's likely. And what's likely is that Jesus was extraordinary, but not unique. Can we get a question from a lady? On this side, there's some ladies over here.
How many more are you?
How are you doing?
We're doing fine.
I guess two more.
Okay, two more.
Two more ladies.
Okay.
Thank you. So you may have answered this already, but I'm going to ask it again directly. Why did you write the book?
Why did I write the book? Very good question. Well, I mean, a lot of reasons. I mean, I wrote the book because I'm deeply, deeply interested in Jesus. I used to know him as a worshiper, and I've known him as an academic, and I have been obsessed with him for 2 decades. I have some, agenda or some motive for writing this book, beyond, obviously, my secret Muslim agenda to destroy Christianity. Besides that, what I wanted to do, well, I guess 2 things. For believers, what I wanted to do was provide what I had said before, to give you an opportunity to understand what it means to believe that Jesus was also a man, and what the consequences of that are. For non-believers, what I wanted to do was to show that this is a man worth following, worth knowing, regardless of what you think about him, whether you think he's God or not. Just the man himself and the example that he set of how to confront social injustice, how to react to the powers that be, how to push back against the gatekeepers of salvation, how to live a life of justice, how to stand up for the poor and the weak and the dispossessed, the marginalized, the outcasts. It doesn't matter whether you think he was also God. Just the example that he set as a person is worth following. So that's it. I wanted to show that you can be a follower of Jesus without necessarily being a Christian.
Okay, I was going to actually go to the back because those people have been.
Okay, how about a lady in the back?
Sorry. He likes the ladies.
Tell my wife.
Thank you for writing this book. You certainly have stirred up a lot of thinking around this topic. As a young woman who grew up a Christian, a Roman Catholic, I have had many doubts about a lot of things of my faith, I admit that. And one of them is, historically, in that period, we know that the Greeks and the Romans were known to have had stories of people that were born man and then evolved into gods and goddesses. I mean, this is not, and Jesus did grow up, if he did indeed live, he did grow up during that time. So my question to you is, can we think of Jesus as someone who evolved into a god? Or did he really come into this world as a god? That's one question I have. And the other question I have is, well, I'll say that.
No, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Please give me your second question.
Well, the question is I'm going to skip it.
Okay, all right. Well, it turns out that there were actually a large group of Christians who believed that very same thing. In fact, they believed it in two different ways. A large group of Christians, sometimes known as Gnostic Christians, though I should emphasize that Gnosticism was an incredibly varied phenomenon, and it came in all kinds of colors and stripes and flavors. But some Gnostics believed that Jesus was a man throughout his entire life, a remarkable man, and then he died, and then he was resurrected as a god. Some Gnostics believed that Jesus was God, but a different God than Yahweh. In fact, that view, it came to be known as Montanism, was a view that was really widespread in the centuries immediately after the destruction of the temple. And again, another view that Nicaea did away with. What they believed was that if you look at the God of the Hebrew Bible and you compare him to the God that Jesus is talking about, they are not the same God. And so therefore, the God of the Hebrew Bible was actually an evil, demonic God, and Jesus was the good God, and that they were battling it out with each other. Some believed that Jesus was a man until the Transfiguration. And that moment when he is, when his outer shell is removed and his inner divinity is made manifest to Peter and to John and to, was it Andrew? That at that moment, he became God. All of this is to say that there have always been multiple and often conflicting interpretations of this man. And it's precisely that image, that the multiple ways in which Jesus can be understood, that has allowed this religion to flourish in the way that it has. If you've ever been, and I'll just end here, if you've ever been to the church in Nazareth, they have this extraordinary artistic display there in the courtyard. What they've done is that they have asked Christian communities from all over the world to depict Mary and Jesus in some artistic fashion. And then they put those paintings all around the area. And it's amazing. The painting from the United States will look very familiar to a lot of you. The painting from Guatemala shows Jesus and Mary as peasant migrant workers. They look like they're picking coffee beans. The painting from China has them as Chinese. They are two Chinese individuals dressed in full Chinese garb. The picture from Thailand has Jesus as a blue character. In other words, he is presented as a Hindu god. And the reason that I bring this up is because that is precisely who Jesus is to these different Christian communities. The fastest growing Christian movement, evangelical movement in the United States is something that's called the prosperity gospel. A lot of my colleagues who do New American religions are obsessed with the prosperity gospel. It's incredibly fast-growing movement. This might sound familiar to some of you. This is the gospel that's preached by people like T.D. Jakes or Joel Osteen. Very, very popular. And I sometimes sum it up as Jesus wants you to drive a Bentley. It's an idea that, as you can imagine, would be extremely difficult to reconcile with Jesus' social teachings. For all, this is a man who said that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven, or the kingdom of God, I'm sorry. And yet, not only has it been reconciled completely, but as I say, it's the fastest growing movement within the evangelical Protestant church in the United States. But just in the United States. This gospel makes no sense at all if you're a Christian in the low hills of Guatemala or Nicaragua, where Jesus is a champion of the poor. Jesus is someone who takes up arms against the oppressor. That Jesus is a warrior who stands up to the rich and the powerful. So which Jesus is he? Is he the poor migrant worker who I've seen in churches presented with a rifle slung over his shoulder in Guatemala? Or is he the blonde, blue-eyed, Bentley driving Jesus who probably has a British accent? He's both. That's who he is. The Christ of faith is powerful precisely because he is who we need him to be. And that's what faith is about. And that's what separates him from, as much as possible, from the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus is frozen in time. And yes, there are multiple interpretations of him. Of course there are. But nevertheless, he is frozen in time. The Christ of faith is eternal, living, always present, and as a result, is always in a state of evolution, always changing to accommodate what we need him to be. Do we need him to be a warrior, or do we need him to be a suburbanite? Whatever we need him to be, that's what he becomes. Thank you.